In the small town of Ashmore, there was a house at the edge of town that nobody visited. It wasn't abandoned or crumbling with age, but rather too pristine, untouched for years. The curtains were always drawn, the garden meticulously kept, and the front door forever locked. The locals called it the Silken House, but few remembered why. Alina Calder, a young woman in her late 20s, had heard the rumors about the house all her life, but had never given them much thought. She had grown up in Ashmore, gone to school there, and even returned after college. But it wasn't until her uncle Henry passed away that her connection to the Silken House became apparent. In his will, he left her the house. There were no explanations, no fond memories shared of why the house had stayed in their family for so long without a tenant, just the keys and a note that read, "Stay out of the attic." Alina, curious but unafraid, decided she would move in. She had no real attachment to the place, and the idea of having her own space appealed to her. When she arrived, she noticed how well kept everything was, almost as though the house had been waiting for her. For the first few days, everything was normal, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something about the house felt alive. There was a warmth to it, a strange vibrancy that made her feel both comforted and unnerved. Oddly enough, she couldn't remember if the note from her uncle had explicitly said not to go to the attic or if it was something she had assumed, but her curiosity gnawed at her. Every night she lay in bed, wondering what was behind that door at the top of the stairs. On the fifth night, Alina woke to the sound of music. Faint at first, like a whisper, but unmistakable, the strumming of a violin. She sat up in bed, her pulse quickening. The sound was coming from above her, the attic. She hesitated, her uncle's warning echoing in her mind. But something about the music was intoxicating, pulling her like an invisible string. She grabbed a candle and slowly made her way up the narrow staircase. The door was old but unlocked. It swung open with an eerie creak. The attic was dimly lit, the only light coming from the moon filtering through a single round window. And there, in the corner, was a large, ornate violin made of dark wood. It sat on a stand, perfectly placed, as though it had been waiting for someone to pick it up. Beside it, a heavy wooden chest was partially open, its contents hidden in shadow. Alina stepped inside, the sound of the violin growing louder, though no one was playing it. As she approached, her fingers itched to touch the strings, to feel the smoothness of the wood beneath her hand. But as she reached for it, she saw something glimmer in the candlelight, a thin, silken thread extending from the violin's bow, leading to the chest. With a chill running down her spine, she opened the chest fully. Inside were rows upon rows of violins, all meticulously arranged, each one with a single silken thread tied to it, and each thread led to a violin bow carved with a name. Her breath caught as she recognized some of the names, people from the town who had disappeared over the years without a trace. Suddenly, the door behind her slammed shut. The violin in the corner began to play, its strings vibrating violently, the notes sharp and discordant. The silken strings began to stretch and move, twisting like living tendrils. Alina backed away, her heart pounding, but the threads followed, snaking towards her, wrapping themselves around her wrists, pulling her toward the violin. She struggled, panic rising, but the more she fought, the tighter the silken strings became. They pulled her hands toward the violin, forcing her fingers to grip the bow. The moment she touched it, the music stopped. Silence filled the room. Alina's breathing was shallow, her hands trembling as she tried to drop the bow, but she couldn't. It was as though it had become part of her, fused to her skin. She stumbled backward, the weight of the violin pulling her down, the silken threads tightening with each movement. And then a voice whispered from behind her, soft and melodic. "Play." Her heart stopped for a moment. She turned slowly, and there, standing in the shadows, was a figure. No, several figures. The missing people of Ashmore. Their faces were blank, eyes hollow, and each of them had a violin in their hands, their bows covered in the same silken strings. "Play," the voice whispered again, this time more urgent, more commanding. Alina raised the bow, her body moving against her will. The moment the bow touched the strings, the room seemed to come alive. The figures began to sway, their hollow eyes fixated on her as they moved in unison to the haunting melody. As she played, the silken threads wound tighter, digging into her skin. She could feel her strength draining, her fingers aching, but she couldn't stop. The music continued, growing louder and faster, filling the room with an overwhelming crescendo. And then, with one final note, the room went silent. The figures stopped moving, the violins in their hands dissolving into dust. The silken strings released their hold, dropping her hands to her sides. For a moment she stood there, frozen in the stillness of the room. But when she looked down, her hands were covered in the same fine silk that had bound the others. She was not free. She was bound, tied to the house and its music, just like the others before her. She would play forever. Alina's fingers moved gracefully over the strings, playing a melody that resonated through the dusty attic. Each note echoed like a heartbeat, thumping in her chest as the memories of the missing townsfolk flooded her mind. Their faces twisted in fear and sorrow, begging for freedom from their cursed existence. As she played, she felt their pain, their longing, intertwining with her own. But amidst the haunting music, a flicker of defiance ignited within her. This was not merely a performance. It was a connection, a chance to break the cycle. With every note she sought to weave a new thread, one of liberation instead of despair. Suddenly, the attic filled with a strange energy, swirling like a tempest. The silken threads binding her began to tremble, loosening their grip just enough for her to feel a glimmer of hope. The ghostly figures, once so hollow, now shimmered with a faint light, their eyes beginning to regain focus. "Play for us," one of the figures, a young man with a violin, urged. "Play for our freedom." Driven by a surge of determination, Alina poured every ounce of her soul into the music, each note resonating with the desire to break free from the shackles of the past. The melody shifted, transforming from sorrowful to uplifting, rising like the dawn after a long night. The attic walls began to vibrate, and for a moment Alina felt as if she was transcending the physical realm, her spirit entwined with the melody. As she played, the threads started to dissolve, disintegrating into shimmering particles that floated around her like fireflies. The figures began to sway, their forms becoming more defined, their features less distorted. Hope filled the air as they joined in, their voices merging with the music. "Together!" they chanted, their harmonies intertwining with Alina's melody. Just as the final note crescendoed into the air, a blinding light enveloped the attic. The music reached a fever pitch, echoing through the house and spilling out into the streets of Ashmore. People began to stop in their tracks, drawn to the hauntingly beautiful sound, their hearts inexplicably tugged by the melody. Outside, the townsfolk gathered, eyes wide and ears tuned in, mesmerized by the inexplicable force that beckoned them. They could feel the weight of the house's history pressing down on their souls, a distant memory of loss and despair. But inside the attic, Alina and the figures were locked in a struggle against the darkness. Just as she struck the final note, the world outside the house began to tremble. A violent wind howled through the town, shaking the foundations of the Silken House. Then, in an explosion of light, the threads that had once bound her shattered, scattering like autumn leaves in the wind. The figures around her gasped, their faces transforming from fear to joy as they stepped forward, unshackled from their torment. But just as they were about to vanish into the light, the room darkened again. The haunting melody became a discordant cacophony, and the ghostly presence of the house surged back. Shadows twisted and coiled, threatening to pull them back into the depths. In a desperate move, Alina reached for the bow, her instincts screaming to keep playing. She felt the music resonating in her core, a final chance to break the cycle. But just as she was about to begin again, a sudden silence fell over the attic. The wind stopped, and the light dimmed. The figures stood still, caught between the realms of the living and the lost. Alina's heart raced as she looked at them, her breath hitching in her throat. Would they be lost forever, or would they find peace? As the shadows closed in, a singular thought pierced through her fear. This was her choice. She could either play and risk being trapped with them, or let go and hope for their freedom. With a heavy heart, she took a step back, lowering the bow. "Go," she whispered, the words barely escaping her lips. "Find your peace." And in that moment, the figures began to shimmer, their forms flickering like candle flames. They nodded, gratitude shining in their hollow eyes. One by one, they stepped into the light, vanishing with soft smiles on their faces, leaving Alina standing alone in the attic. The house shuddered, and Alina felt a wave of energy wash over her. The silken threads dissipated, the oppressive weight lifting. She had broken the curse, not just for herself, but for all those who had suffered. As the echoes of the music faded, she turned to leave, but the attic door slammed shut. Panic surged as the walls began to close in, shadows dancing around her. The house was alive, and it wasn't finished with her yet. Suddenly, the music resumed, the notes echoing eerily through the air. Alina turned, heart racing, and saw a new violin in the corner. This one smaller, almost delicate, with her name engraved on it. The silken threads twitched, and she understood. The house had found a new thread to weave. With a deep breath, Alina picked up the bow, feeling the weight of the house's history in her hands. As she began to play, the melody was no longer just a song. It was a promise to those who had come before her. And with each note, the room pulsed with energy, resonating with a future yet to be written. A story that was far from over.